So I wanted to get into there's Arkansas case on trans issues that I wanted to get to. We also have what I would consider a crackdown or war on drag queens, and then a little bit later on we can get into the Target and Bud Light boycotts, potentially the Dodger stuff, and then also the Trump indictment and Hunter indictment as well. So let's start with the Arkansas case, where most of the headlines I'm seeing on this are saying that the Arkansas has struck down a ban on gender affirming care for transgender youth. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting case because the judge said the state did not. This was a case brought by the ACLU on behalf of some kids and on behalf of some doctors, and they said the state didn't prove that their law was actually basically they didn't prove that the medical care was harmful. They did not provide sufficient evidence that that the puberty blockers and hormones being prescribed to kids were harming their health as opposed to being helpful. And therefore, it's part of the doctor's rights to be able to prescribe that care, the parents' rights to be able to approve that care, and the children's rights to be able to get that care. And the reason I think that's interesting is because the science itself is so difficult on this question that in Europe, from the UK, Norway, Sweden, they started with laws that look like ours, and they've ended up really restricting that care without the American political left-right binary because they have a more concentrated, they have socialized medicine, for instance, in the UK. So the Tavistock Clinic gave them a really clear sample study. Like they were able to say, we have X number of people went through this one program, and we think it should be restricted. We think that, it was being overprescribed. So US laws are out of step with what's happened in Europe, but what's interesting about that is you have judges trying to grapple with the studies, and you have judges trying to grapple with the science, and the science itself is, I think, really difficult on these cases.
So, sorry, just to interject because I wanted
Yeah.
to read the quote. So the person involved in the case is a 17-year-old transgender boy from Arkansas, and the plaintiff in the lawsuit. And they said, quote, "I'm so grateful the judge heard my experience of how this healthcare has changed my life for the better and saw the dangerous impact this law could have on my life and that of countless other transgender people." And the judge said that the law also violates the constitutional rights of transgender youth and their parents and their medical providers. So would you say that they got it right, or would you say to this guy like, nah, too bad, like let's not agree with this case?
Wait, the judge got it right, or that the law?
Do you think that this 17-year-old who was the plaintiff, who is thanking the judge, would you say to them like, I disagree with the outcome of the case?
With the outcome of so the law itself, I think this is one of the problems, is that on the right, there are really imperfect laws that target, I think, legitimate problems. This is a big DeSantis issue, like the Stop Woke Act. It's a very imperfect bill. I'm worried more about the problem itself than the than the attempts to address the problem. And so that doesn't mean I think this law is perfect. I do not think a minor should be able to consent to any medicine that we don't know whether or not it has irreversible damage in the long term. So puberty blockers, hormone therapy, I think that should wait until an adult can make the decision. A child shouldn't be able to make that decision. The parent shouldn't be able to make that decision on behalf of the child because there's the issue of developing bodies.
I think
17, man, that's kind of.
I know, it is old. It's
Yeah, we're not talking about an 8-year-old or anything. Go
One
ahead.
thing that I
agree.
always bring up here is puberty blockers and hormones oftentimes get lumped together.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to note puberty blockers have actually been used for a long time,
Mhm.
for example, for girls who have early onset of puberty.
Yes.
And there was never the same level of concern about, what this could mean for these girls for the rest of their lives. I certainly think there is some evidence that there can be consequences, right? That there
Right.
can be health adverse effects from puberty blockers. Those are also, though, hormones can be irreversible in some ways, like some of the changes that you, especially at a young age, that you go through,
Yes.
you can't take back, right?
Right.
Puberty blockers are a little bit different. You stop taking the puberty blockers, you go through puberty,
Yeah.
right? So I just want to make that distinction there. Do you think that laws and these types of restrictions are even the right way to go about this? Because part of what we've seen is, the politics of this is a disgusting mess,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
There's,
absolutely.
on the right, there's certainly, and what this judge speaks to, there's certainly no attempt to actually get at the truth of what the medicine is and what the trade-offs are and what this looks like. I just saw another judge actually struck down Florida's prohibition on Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care. There's spillover effects that go beyond just
Yeah.
care for trans children. So are like politicians the right people to be deciding these things, or shouldn't it be more left to doctors, families, and that sort, the medical professionals and the experts who are actually on the front lines of understanding this care and balancing what I think everyone has to acknowledge is a complicated and nuanced situation that doesn't lend itself easily to a one-size-fits-all approach.
I think the very legitimate and anguishing condition of gender dysphoria was being better treated by physicians, parents, before it got hyper-politicized. I absolutely think that's the ideal situation. The hormone point is a really interesting one, and the puberty blocker point is a really interesting one. Puberty blockers in particular, because they have been used for a while. A while is interesting though, because to me, I look at that and I'm like, okay, so several decades is how long we've used this treatment,
Right.
and that's a lot of time. In the scope of human history, it's a fairly short experiment. And I actually find that very interesting. I think that's a problem with the food we eat. I think it's a problem with the medications we take in general, that so much of it has been developed over the last several decades to the point where we don't really know fully how that stuff has affected our bodies, especially in different quantities over periods of time. So, for instance, with hormones and puberty blockers, you basically create a permanent patient. You really have to keep taking that stuff. And I've talked to the parents, totally apolitical people, and some people center left, and kids themselves who have started down this path, ended up not really liking it, in fact, being like really upset about it. And people have different experiences, like the kid in this lawsuit that we're talking about. So I get it. People have different experiences with it. But I also think we just really don't totally know long term what this does to the human body when you have to keep taking it month after month after month. And that's what really concerns me. And I've seen parents go down the road, recognize that, and people who, for instance, are totally apolitical. I've talked to them myself, someone from my hometown who got caught up in one of these national lawsuits. And they have come down not on the side of the left, but on the side of the people who have been trying to push back. And that's not just people on the left; it's people sort of on the right, the center, the TERFs, of course. It's a big community, and it's just. But to your point, Krystal, even having to have those conversations, even having to hear that from the 17-year-old in the lawsuit, it just sucks that we're talking about this in the sort of like Democrat versus Republican political Thunderdome.
So a couple things. First of all, I would say the detransition rate is super low in the U.S., which leads me to believe that the overwhelming majority of people, they start going down this path. They're not doing it willy-nilly. They ultimately are like, this is definitely the right thing for me.
Is that adults or kids?
Overall, the detransition rate I've seen is very, very low. I mean, it's over, 95% of people who end up, if they start going down the path, they continue going down the path. I'd also say the point that, like, this is something you have to take forever, I don't find that particularly persuasive because, like, insulin is as well. So, it's not like that by itself makes me go, oh, this is bad, we must reevaluate it. The other thing is, on this law, the Arkansas law also barred state funds and insurance coverage for gender-affirming care and allowed private insurers to refuse to cover such care for people of any age.
Yeah.
So there's another thing that we've seen is like a spillover where it doesn't just impact the kids. It gets, it impacts older people as well. And that happened in Florida as well, too, by the way. They said nurse practitioners can't, give out the treatment, and like 80% of trans people in Florida get it from nurse practitioners, so a lot of them are struggling to get the care they need. And then the final thing, and I'll let you respond, is so the law in Arkansas was vetoed by Governor Asa Hutchinson, a Republican, and he cited the potentially dangerous consequences for trans youth in the state and called it a vast government overreach and a product of the culture war in America. But his veto was overturned by state lawmakers. But how do you respond to that? I feel like that's pretty damning evidence that they were taking a moderate approach, and then this was an overreach.
I would say Asa Hutchinson is a great example of a Republican who is like bought and paid for by the corporate establishment and is not to be trusted on positions when it comes to economics or culture. Tucker Carlson did a pretty persuasively bad interview with Asa Hutchinson when he vetoed that bill.
What's he bought off by big trans? I don't understand.
So for instance, the Human Rights Campaign, their healthcare equality index is bankrolled by Pfizer. It's actually like a really, I think, severe conflict of interest that you have Pfizer bankrolling HRC's Healthcare Equality Index, which takes into account things like gender-affirming care, so puberty blockers, hormones. Like that is actually a very real concern of mine, and I think it is coloring the way that corporations are responding to advocacy groups, dark money groups, places like HRC. I find that to be a very real problem. I don't think the right is necessarily consistent when they say, "Oh, this is all being bankrolled by pharma and dark." It was like the right has supported things for years that are being bankrolled by pharma and dark money. So I don't think it's a consistent position. But from the perspective of somebody who is, I would say, personally consistent on the question of dark money and and on those issues, I do find that to be a real concern.
But you don't think he thinks it's a vast government overreach? You think he was
I think he
basically bought
does.
for this position?
No, I think he does think it's a vast government overreach because I think he has a concept of this sort of like old Republican concept of what constitutes vast government overreach, which is basically anything that creates guardrails in society. So if pharma says we have this new treatment that can be used in a way that's going to create all kinds of new patients, let's put the trans issue aside. Let's say it's something else. I think it's a responsible policy if that drug is harmful to say no. And I think Asa Hutchinson trusts industry more than he trusts the sort of Republican system.
I hear you, but Trump did right to try, which is the opposite of that. It's like, try whatever the hell you want to try if you're
Yeah.
about to die. So he's sort of like guardrails off type thing. I think that his position on this, and then I'll let you in, Krystal, but I think his position on this, I think there is an argument from a small government conservative perspective of like, hey, let's just get the government out of this. So I think,
There is.
yeah.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
just don't
it's
think
the
it's
same
the right
libertarian
position.
argument. I see some parallels, not to totally equate them, but with the debate around choice, because it's like, all
Yeah,
right,
totally.
this is very complicated. Every single instance is going to have its own unique dynamics around it. Really, the people who are in the best position to make these challenging, morally difficult decisions are the mother, the family, the doctor, in consultation with the doctor. And I feel very much the same about this issue as well. One thing, Emily, that I'm curious about from your perspective, I suspect you have a detailed knowledge of, is like, where did this all come from?
Mhm.
Like, this is the, it seems to me, in terms of the online right,
Yeah.
like this is the issue,
Mhm.
right? There's, and you're talking about a small percentage of the population.
Yeah.
When you get into some of the more niche concerns, like, girls' athletics, which none of these people have any other track record of caring about, but suddenly this is like, all consuming to them.
Yeah.
Like-
we must protect the WNBA at all costs.
Right, exactly. Like, have you literally ever, can you name one player? Like, just one player. Just name one. Anyway, so where did this new fixation really come from?
Hmm. Well, I think the sex and gender stuff has obviously been interesting to the right for a long time, going back to the fixation on like the feminist movement. And some of this comes from that. Actually, I remember, so my college job was working for Christina Hoff Sommers, who wrote a book in 1999. She's a dissident feminist professor. Her story is really, really interesting. She's probably more attributed to the right now, even though she's like a Bernie curious type person. And she was a women's studies professor. She was a philosophy professor who was cross-listed in the women's studies department. Ended up working at the American Enterprise Institute because she wrote a book called Who Stole Feminism in '94 that got her blacklisted from the women's studies conferences and all of that fun stuff. And so when I was working for Christina for a couple of years in college, I was helping her with research on it. And it was surprising back 2012, 2013, 2014, how often this very issue was coming up in the research about what's best for boys in education. Like, what is the concept? Like, what is masculinity? What is femininity? And then that's where we started talking about, I think as a culture, toxic masculinity. And once the conversation about toxic masculinity and Gamergate started, like that snowball starts rolling down the hill, the whole conversation about sex and gender has just exploded with social media. The thing for me, Camille Paglia said this in 2016, I think it was. She said, when Obama did the Title IX Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education, from his Education Secretary John King, that said you have to read gender identity into sex in Title IX. That is really, she said, that's when I knew Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election. That wasn't the same for me, but I do think that was the root of so much of this because it was a blanket declaration from the federal government that changed the way every public school and every community was suddenly impacted by this major change. And from there, I think that was a huge part of, like, since it started touching so many communities, the right was really freaked out by it.
I really think that the online right is obsessed with this in a way that nobody else is. Like, I always see people on the online right talking about this endlessly. And then I actually don't see that much on the left. And if anybody on the left is talking about it, it's
Yeah.
like a reaction to a new law that's being pushed by the right. But I just wanted to give the guidelines as to how it works right now. Because look, my default assumption was like, I understand when people say they don't, kids shouldn't be allowed to do X, Y, or Z, and they want to protect the kids, etc. I understand that argument. But then when I actually researched it and saw how it functions right now, my reaction was like, oh, this is actually super reasonable the way it already works. So apparently, puberty blockers are used if, they have dysphoria. Typically, this occurs around age 8 to 18 for girls and a year or two later for boys. Apparently, those side effects are reversible, so that doesn't strike me as big of a deal as many people make it out to be.
Mm-hmm.
The guidelines recommend hormones at 16 or older.
Mhm.
I didn't know that until I started researching this. Guidelines say that surgery should generally be reserved for those age 18 and older. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health says breast removal surgery is okay for those under 18 who have been on testosterone for at least a year. But as we already pointed out, hormones start at 16. So in most cases, you're going to be 17 or older if you even do a top surgery.
Yeah.
So when I look at that, I go, okay, clearly there are people who are experts in this field, who are well versed in it, who have thought about it thoroughly. There's kids who are dealing with gender dysphoria. And there's like an intelligent process that people go through to make these decisions. So given that that's the reality, I feel like my default assumption becomes, well, yeah, keep the government out of it. Because now you see all these bills that are trying to, criminalize certain things, and it's even spilling over into impacting trans adults. Why is it not? Isn't this much ado about nothing, given that these are the guidelines and they seem really reasonable?
No, I think that's a helpful point. I still think there's not enough long-term research. And I mean, like, that's part of the problem is people are necessarily kind of guinea pigs that the medical community says, yes, this is safe. And you're willing as an adult to go through and be one of the people who spends a lifetime on these medications, even if it's like insulin. We don't know. We truly don't know that quantity with that much time, how much this would affect people, not just physically, but also mental health. Testosterone hormones are a really powerful component of our mental health. And so I think the divide in the conversation here is that I don't think there's enough evidence to say this isn't malpractice. You think there is enough evidence to say it isn't malpractice. And so that informs my approach to the policies.
But I'm just taking their word for it, right? Like, we know that if they don't take it, in cases of people that have severe gender dysphoria, that's when they have the suicidal ideation and they're severely depressed and they have the anxiety. And just from personal anecdotal experience, I've had people reach out to me doing my show and they explain to me, like, look, I have gender dysphoria. I'm trans. As soon as I, started transitioning and having gender affirming care, I felt much better.
Yeah.
So I look at that and I go, God bless, right? Like, what am I going to do? Override that?
Totally. I've heard the opposite. I mean, I've heard people who have said that it was.
But it's a numbers game, right?
There's the studies on that are pretty mixed though, on suicidal ideation post and pre. There's some that does show that, and there are also physicians that have taken a lot of risks to say they're uncomfortable with the treatment.
But why is the detransition rate so low then? I feel like if what you were saying was true, it'd be like 70% detransition rate. We just don't see that. We see like 1% to 5% detransition rate.
Because I think there's been, in the last couple of years, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there were transitions both socially and medically that were part of a social contagion. And I would expect, and people are more than welcome to fact check me on this in 10 years. But I would expect that as the research comes out, based on conversations that I've had with people, based on medical professionals that I've talked to, it's hard to say. But I would expect in 10 years we see different stats and studies on that.
So I think the social contagion thing is very disputed. But
Yeah,
even if
I think the anti-trans stuff is social
But
contagion.
listen,
Well, I think they both are.
true. That's true. Even if we say, okay, there's a social contagion going on, and that's why you see a rise in the number of people who are identifying as trans or non-binary or whatever, which again, highly disputed. But let's say that that's the case. To me, the argument that you're making about, these treatments haven't been tested over 100 years or whatever, you could basically make against every medicine that's on the market.
I agree.
And so, at some point you have to go like, this is the research we have. We know that if you don't follow these, clinically tested procedures, that you're going to have these issues and you're going to have health issues and you're going to have depression and suicide ideation, all those things. So we're taking a calculated risk here. To me, the problem comes in when you have the government trying to come between you and your doctor and say, well, your doctor, who's an expert, may say that this is the best thing for you, and you may agree with that finding, but we, Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump or Asa Hutchinson or whoever it is, we actually know better, and we are going to ban you from getting a medically approved, clinically tested treatment that your doctor recommends. And that seems to have much broader implications to me than just with regards to the issue of transitioning.
Well, this is another interesting point about the online right. For me, who kind of grew up as a conservative in the Tea Party era, although not always sort of a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, this has been a huge wake-up call about dark money, about corporations.
It comes from the trans issue, really?
Not just the trans issue, but genuinely the food, medicine. The online right is freaking out about health right now, and there's like this big. Remember when Tucker Carlson had the balls?
Yeah, the ball tanning thing.
The ball tanning thing.
It's very admitted to doing, and I'm traumatized forever now.
Why did you have to do that to me?
Sorry.
Well, there's cameras on. Why did you have to do that to them? Okay, well, anyway, as much as I can try to refocus my brain, but like actually that I think is a wake up in general. I think some of the interest in RFK Jr. and in Marianne, it comes from that because people on the right are
Don't
saying...
equate those two. Don't equate those two.
No, but I think
Marianne is a gym.
So, agreed. But the question of like what we've been putting into our bodies for like the past 100 years, some of these things, like for instance, canola oil. This is like an incredibly new thing for humans to be consuming in massive quantities, and there's such corporate capture in the regulatory agencies that we have not questioned it.
Yeah.
Like, and and so like when it is true, like we say like let go and let God, and like let the doctors say we're the experts on this. I think a lot of those decisions have actually and will continue to prove to have been wrong, and to a certain extent, you have to let them do that. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of evidence, especially on issues like this one, that when people have no incentive to speak out because they're going to be called bigoted or a TERF or whatever for having questions,
But see,
then
to me,
you get doctors who are, you can't really trust the opinion in broad senses.
Lord knows we have critique. A wide-ranging critique of for-profit healthcare, big pharma, corrupt influence, etc.
Cares about. They don't.
But I'm saying that's what I care about.
Yeah, well,
yeah,
that's
no,
fair,
I don't
but
want to.
I mean, I'm not casting aspersions on you, but I think the rest of the online
tar you with like whatever else is going on out there
is more like what they do.
But like the idea that an improvement to the current system is like, so let's put Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden in charge of your healthcare and like determine what sort of treatments you can get. Right, and Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, like that doesn't seem like a solution to me. And that's where, to get to Kyle's point about like, this is not what they really care about. All that energy, which is in certain ways righteous, around concern around our food, concern around our health, concern around corruption, all of those things, like to the idea that there's any sort of nascent awakening there on the right, it all then gets channeled into the most superficial critiques of like, and the problem is because they had a gay person on the corporate board or because Target did a pride display. That's where the issue is. And it's like, wait, you were starting down the path and now it's just been completely diverted to something that, look, I'm sure Target is annoyed right now by the protests and boycotts. Does it hurt them at all if they have to like pull their pride display? No, they don't care. No. They don't care. I mean, Bud Light also, they've taken a hit from the boycotts, et cetera. Do you think that they're real LGBTQ allies? No, they just thought they would like use a trans influencer to make more money. So you're not hitting them where it hurts. You're not changing the system. You just have this like superficial, like, let's just throw woke out there and totally divert any reasonable energy.
I'm sorry, I have to go further because I don't like, if there a concern was actually like, oh yeah, the right's waking up to like concerns about corporate power. As part of the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden did a 15% corporate minimum tax rate for all corporations. This is at a time they used to pay nothing in taxes, or someone would pay a negative income tax rate, which is literally they're getting like a net subsidy from the taxpayers. Yeah. Not a single person on the right was like, base Joe Biden, 15% corporate minimum tax rate. These people don't care. It's not about that.
Are you talking about Republican politicians, or are you talking about
both
regular Republicans?
Both. Nobody gives credit. Like, okay, hold on. Joe Biden's net brought jobs back here. Trump net outsourced 200,000 jobs. Not a single person on the right has been like, based Biden standing up corporations.
So politicians, I'll Krystal.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, partly that's because none of that is being told to them in conservative media.
That's
number one.
It if it is.
But if you poll Republicans, you will see some concern about corporate power. You will see a majority of people saying corporations should be taxed more.
Agreed, right.
So I would say among regular people who are Republicans, there is some nascent interest in curbing corporate power. And I would say elites and media manipulate them into like, and it's because they had a diversity training.
I'm with you, but it's nominal versus effective. It's one thing to say to a pollster, but then you turn around and vote for like Jim Inhofe, and it's like, okay, there's sort of a disconnect here, isn't there?
Well, and it's like the DNC. So like it's like what the DNC does with candidates. It's actually pretty hard for Republicans, especially since this stuff has trickled into the kind of conservative bloodstream very slowly. Like, I actually agree. There's way too little coverage. The CHIPS Act was bipartisan, and that did bring jobs back. Although like people like Marco Rubio pulled their votes at the last minute because it did have
Bernie did
carve-outs for Intel and But all that is to say, it's trickling very slowly into the bloodstream. The conservative movement is trying to catch up with it, but I think a huge part of the problem is that the right is way too freaking online. You see this with the DeSantis and Trump campaigns, who are just mired in these stupid conflicts, and the same thing with the very online capital V, capital O right pundits, who are mired in these stupid online conflicts that have absolutely nothing to do with the daily life of the average conservative voter, Republican voter, Democrat voter, and that's where, again, people who are sitting around looking at our politics and going, what the heck, basically, then look and say, I have nobody speaking for me, and I'll vote for Jim Inhofe because the person on the left is, from my perspective, even worse on a host of different issues. But it's just it's a disaster.
Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.